Scene 8. 3/4 of an hour later. So structurally, it's important when analysing Blanche's birthday party that you remember that the birthday party is taking place over both scene 7 and scene 8, and it will be later of the same evening, so all of this symbolically happening on her birthday when she's confronted by Mitch, and that narrative arc of her romance, her fleeting romance with Mitch, comes to an end, and then the climactic scene 10 also takes place on Blanche's birthday with Stanley's sexual assault. So this scene adds to the dramatic tension that's been created in the scene previously, with Stanley exposing lie number 1 and lie number 2 about Blanche. And now, 3/4 of an hour later, the scene continues. The view through the big windows is fading gradually into a still golden dusk. A touch of sunlight blazes on the side of a big water tank or oil drum across the empty lot toward the business district, which is now pierced by pinpoints of lighted windows, all windows reflecting the sunset. The three people are completing a dismal birthday supper. Stanley looks sullen, Stella is embarrassed and sad, Blanche has a tight, artificial smile drawn on her face. The fourth place at the table is left vacant. Okay. So the opening stage direction gives us a description of light, of the sunlight blazing, and it's just starting to fade a little bit. There's a sense of a sunset coming, so the sun is dawning. You can interpret this sunset, if you like, as the sun setting symbolically on the hope in Blanche's life at both constructing a new identity for herself and also more so her relationship with Mitch. It was like the sun was rising in scene 6 and now the sun is setting, so students have analysed the pathetic fallacy of the sunset that opens scene 8 3/4 of an hour later, and equally the dramatic irony which we are reminded of as an audience. The fourth place at the table is left vacant, and that silence on the stage speaks volumes to the audience. We share a knowingness with the antagonist Stanley and with Stella as to why that place is left vacant at the table. We know, as Stanley said, Mitch is a friend of mine, and that he's not going to allow Mitch to jump into a tank with sharks, i.e. Blanche. Stanley tells a joke, tells a funny story to make us all laugh. I don't know what's the matter. We're all so solemn. Is it because I've been stood up by my beau? So her beau has stood her up. Mitch, naturally, he's not arrived. It immediately addresses the vacant seat at the table. And Blanche goes into this joke shortly about a parrot, which I won't read, but I'll just give you a sense of what might be interesting about it. Before that, though, and ironically, she mentions, it's the first time in my entire experience with men, and then, funnily enough, she says, I've had a good deal of all sorts, that I've actually been stood up by anybody. I don't know how to take it. So, I think, obviously, this is funny for an unintentional reason, that she's had a good deal of all sorts in terms of experiences with men, because this was part of what Stanley was attempting to bring to light in the scene prior to this. Blanche's notion of not knowing how to take it. We know that her experiences with men, the intimacies that she's had with strangers, her husband Alan Gray, Mitch now as well, have often been a source of conflict or trauma for her. Stanley says, I don't think you like my stories, Blanche. I like them when they're amusing but not indecent. So once again, we have a reminder here of what Blanche is postulating as part of her image. She said earlier that a vulgar action or a crude remark is something that she can't tolerate. She will go on to say that deliberate cruelty is the one unforgivable sin. And also this notion here as well, part of her prim and proper composition, that she allegedly likes Stanley's stories, but not when they are indecent, because she's maintaining appearances of being this sort of conservative Southern belle. I don't know any refined enough for your taste. Then let me tell you one. Yes, encourages Stella. You tell one, Blanche. You know lots of good stories. So Blanche goes into this fairly juvenile, infantile story of a parrot who, one day when the preacher comes to the house, lets out a blasphemous goddamn, but that was a short day. And it's quite an archaic joke. It's a joke about what would even in that era be considered a sort of archaic expletive, to take the god's name in vain. And this preacher who overhears the parrot repeating what the owners have been saying. And, it's not, I don't think there's anything significant in that. It might indicate to you her sort of outdated sense of humour, belonging to this kind of older world where these things were of a concern. I think what is in particular interesting about it is the way that Blanche reacts to it. She throws back her head and laughs, so she finds the subject of the story hysterical, whereas obviously the other two don't really. And that's, I think, just a telling moment of the scene, showing you Blanche's sort of out-of-date incongruousness to the setting. Apparently, Mr. Kowalski was not amused, says Stella. So as she's been doing this, Stanley has been paying no attention to the story. He's reached over the table and speared his fork into the remaining chop, which from a psychoanalytical perspective could be interpreted as phallic imagery, and he's eating with his fingers. So just like earlier in the play, specifically in scene number 3, but even in the scene prior to this, we have a moment now of confrontation between Stanley and Stella. There are some of these moments throughout the play. It's important to observe them. Stella, in some ways, is empowered as a wife. Apparently, Mr. Kowalski was not amused, says Blanche. And Stella shouts out, Mr. Kowalski is too busy making a pig of himself to think of anything else. That's right, baby, says Stanley indifferently. Your face and your fingers are disgustingly greasy. Go and wash up and then help me clear the table. So we've seen, like in scene 3, prior to when he strikes her, as well in the scene before this, that Stella certainly is not afraid of confronting Stanley and of sort of attempting to correct his behaviour. Her notion here that it's disgustingly greasy, she commands him to go and wash up and then help her clear the table. She says that his face and fingers are disgustingly greasy, that he's making a pig of himself. They are nice moments of the play because they show you that Stella isn't entirely a submissive housewife. And in response to what he perceives as a great insult, Stanley hurls his plate to the floor. And also, as you're about to see, he also seizes her arm. So often with Stanley, his aggression manifests itself verbally and also physically. In the course of this play, it has been mentioned that he smashed the light bulbs on the night of his wedding, albeit out of joy, and Stella in a way was thrilled by that. But also in this play, he has smashed his radio, he's thrown that out of the window, he has slapped Stella quite hard on the back of the thigh, and also struck Stella in scene 3. In this scene, he's about to smash plates and hurl saucers. He's seizing her arm in this sequence as well. That's how I'll clear the table, he asserts in an exclamation. Don't ever talk that way to me. Pig, Polak, disgusting, vulgar, greasy. Them kind of words have been on your tongue and your sister's tongue too much around here. What do you think you are, a pair of queens? Remember what Huey Long said, every man is a king, and I am the king around here, so don't forget it. He hurls a cup and saucer to the floor. So these assertions of his patriarchal dominance, the two sisters stunned and frightened into silence, physically imposing himself like he will do in scene 10 and like he did do in scene 3. You see the dysfunction of their relationship and the way in which Stanley he communicates through his sort of brutish physicality. He uses the excuse of being insulted at the types of words that he has been called. But at the same time, we get the sense here that he doesn't like to be emasculated, and that's the way that I would want you to interpret Stella's words to him. Why he's so fiery in his rebuttal is because I think he sees it as an attack on his masculinity, on his dominance, on his status as the head of the household, and in response to that emasculation by his wife, he reacts in quite a macho, aggressive, physical way, seizing her arm once again, hurling plates and saucers to the floor. And you can see just in response to this, the women are unable to hold their own with him. So Stella can do nothing but cry weakly. It's very similar to Stella at the end of the scene before this. She's constantly asking, what will Blanche do? What will she do? She has to make quiet acceptance with the fact that she is sort of entrapped in Stanley's in a relationship with Stanley in a slightly different way, but you know, she's doesn't have much agency. Stanley goes out and he lights a cigarette. And then I like this as well. He often makes reference to the jazz musicians in New Orleans. It's a reminder and a moment where the sort of cosmopolitan, raffish charm of New Orleans, this allegedly progressive and modern post-war American city in the French Quarter, a bohemian and a place of an easy intermingling of races, is being contrasted with the events of this household. So it's almost as though the sound of the jazz, as it starts to penetrate into this scene, is contrasting the sort of more archaic and regressive types of dynamics which are going on inside of the Kowalski apartment. What happened while I was bathing? What did he tell you, Stella? Nothing, 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 she exclaims. I think he told you something about Mitch and me. You know why Mitch shouldn't come, but you won't tell me. Stella shakes her head helplessly. I'm going to call him. I wouldn't call him Blanche. I'm going to call him on the phone. I wish you wouldn't. I intend to be given some explanation from someone. So she rushes to the phone in the bedroom, and whilst Blanche is doing this, I'll just sort of highlight this for you. Whilst this is going on, there is a conversation happening outside with Stanley and Stella, which I want to pay particular mind to. So Stella just basically rushes onto the porch and stares reproachfully at Stanley, and then says, I hope you're pleased with your doings. I never had so much trouble swallowing food in my life. Looking at that girl's face and the empty chair. Meanwhile, Blanche is on the phone. She doesn't get anywhere, and it goes into this quite important sequence between Stanley and Stella. And I just want to first of all point out to you that this ends with Stella inviting Stanley back into the apartment. So whatever it is that Stanley says here in the middle is enough to assuage Stella's anger, to the extent where she actually invites him back into the apartment, even though just above this, she chides him for being pleased with his doings and tells him that she's never had so much trouble swallowing her food yet. Something he says in here is significant, and I think the appeal that's being made is to sexual desire. He says that everything will be all right once Blanche goes and they can make noise in the night the way that they used to and get the coloured lights going. The coloured lights being a euphemism for sex, and equally this notion as well that Stanley has kind of turned Blanche into the reason for the dysfunction in his and Stella's relationship. Blanche is a helpful scapegoat for Stanley. He's basically making the argument that everything was okay until Blanche showed up. And you could argue here that Stella's invitation of Stanley to come back into the apartment with her indicates to you that increasingly Stella is abandoning Blanche, in the way, ironically, that Blanche accused Stella of abandoning her in scene 1 with regards to Belle Reve. As the play progresses, we could make that argument that increasingly Stella becomes disenfranchised from Blanche. Stanley is able to sort of alienate Stella from Blanche, and this component of sexual desire, it was in scene, scene 4, in which Blanche warns Stella that what she feels for Stanley is desire, just desire, brutal desire. And I think here again you're reminded that the sexual dynamic in Stanley and Stella's relationship is so overwhelmingly powerful that it can overcome any dysfunction or issue which they have in their relationship. Stella, it's going to be alright after she goes and after you've had the baby. It's going to be alright again between me and you, the way that it was. You remember the way that it was? Them nights we had together? So you see it's dripping with that sort of sexual quality. God, honey, it's going to be sweet when we can make noise in the night the way that we used to and get the coloured lights going with nobody's sister behind the curtains to hear them. Come on back in. She returns to the kitchen and starts lighting the candles on the white cake. Blanche? Yes. She returns from the bedroom to the table in the kitchen. Now he generates a bit of pathos and sympathy for Blanche's character. She is well-intentioned, Blanche. Oh, those pretty little candles, Blanche exclaims. Don't burn them, Stella. You ought to save them for baby's birthdays. I hope candles are going to glow in his life, and I hope that his eyes are going to be like candles, like 2 blue candles lighted in a white cake. Now, I don't have the full version of it here in my edition, but if you were to just cast your eyes over yours, you'll see that Blanche here makes a really interesting comment about the symbolism of candles and the light which represents hope fading out too quickly in young boys' and girls' eyes. She thinks of herself. She says, this baby's aunt knows what that feels like to lose hope. So her wish here is for this baby to have more hope in its life than she's been allowed to have in hers. And Stanley, like he was at the very beginning of scene 7, openly contemptuous. What poetry, he exclaims. I shouldn't have called him, speaking of Mitch. There's lots of things that could have happened. There's no excuse for it, Stella. I don't have to put up with insults. I won't be taken for granted. So this is part of this new image that she's cultivating for herself. God damn, it's hot in here with the steam from the bathroom. I've said I was sorry 3 times, exclaims out Blanche. I take hot baths for my nerves. Hydrotherapy, they call it. You healthy. And bearing in mind that it was only a moment ago, so let me just scroll back up to that because you'll see how soon it was. Stanley seized Stella's arm, hurled a plate to the floor, and don't ever talk to me that way again, pig, Polak, disgusting, doesn't like the racial slur, Blanche, not been paying close enough attention to this, you healthy Polak, without a nerve in your body, of course you don't know what anxiety feels like. And Stanley, a famous set of lines from him, I am not a Polak. People from Poland are Poles, not Polacks. What I am is 100% American, born and raised in the greatest country on earth and proud as hell of it. So don't ever call me a Polak. And these lines of Stanley's are important. His sense of nationalism, both from his military service, but also from his identity as an American, which he has fully accepted and brought into. He doesn't acknowledge so much his Polish heritage. It doesn't mean as much to him clearly as his American status does, and it's an indicator for you that we have a sort of transformation of the American society itself and what types of people could call themselves Americans, and how Stanley's Americanism contrasts quite heavily with Blanche's Americanism. And the phone rings. Oh, that's for me. I'm not sure. Keep your seat. It's Mac on the phone. He has a quick conversation with Mac, and then Stanley, again, whilst he's on the phone, you see this kind of overtly aggressive and insulting quality. I think it's just nice. It's just nice evidence for Stanley and the ways in which he imposes himself on other characters. Okay, so now he gives Blanche the bus ticket. I've got a little birthday remembrance from you. And in the stage direction as well, it points out that he does this with false amiability. So, in other words, he's doing this, it seems as though he's being quite sincere, and he's about to give Blanche something which will really upset her and hurt her. This is an example in the text of deliberate cruelty. The one thing which Blanche thinks is unforgivable. Oh, have you, Stanley? What is it? Is it for me? He holds the little envelope towards her. Yes, I hope you like it. Why? Why, it's a ticket, he exclaims. This is deliberate cruelty. Back to Laurel. On the Greyhound. Tuesday. And the Vesuviana music steals in. So remember, the Vesuviana music is used as a motif to signal Blanche's psychological trauma from the emotional impact of Alan Gray's betrayal, but now that sense of trauma, that sense of betrayal, that sense of victimhood returns to her as Stanley gives her a ticket to send her home. Stella, it's nice, it's symbolic of her situation in this scene. All she can do is rise abruptly and turn her back to Blanche's humiliation, unable to assist or help. Blanche runs off into the next room, clutches her through and into the bathroom. Coughing, gagging sounds are heard. And you see Stella immediately addresses this idea of deliberate cruelty. You didn't need to do that. You needn't to have been so cruel to someone alone as she is. So I think here we're getting that sense now of the tragedy of Blanche's existence. I mean, Stella has been pointing it out to us from the beginning of the play, but Blanche's loneliness, her isolation, forms a large part of her tragic identity. And for Stanley, the antagonist, to ensure that Blanche's loneliness is amplified by alienating Mitch from her, by alienating to an extent Stella from her, sending her back home to Laurel where he knows that she has no connections, nor even a home or a job. You know, he's deliberately constructed this to amplify her suffering. And I really like the fact that Stella confronts him here again with this notion of cruelty, because that's going to be important in the following scene, in scene 9. Delicate piece she is, he says. And she agrees, you know, so the sensitive, tender and delicate. I think tender is the only word that's not used in relationship to Blanche in the play. But Stella affirms that she was. You didn't know Blanche as a girl. I say that and there it is, so tender. So it's letter to Breen, tender, sensitive, delicate. All three of those adjectives are used in the play to describe Blanche. She was tender and trusting, and then a key quotation for Stella, but people like you abused her and forced her to change. And I think that might be, of all of the things which Stella says to justify Blanche's behaviour, to generate sympathy for her, to point out the height of her suffering, this one statement, that people like you, her own husband, abused her and forced her to change. So in other words, abused her tenderness, her trusting nature, her delicateness, forcing her to change. I think this statement stands probably as the strongest statement Stella makes in defense of Blanche. He crosses into the bedroom, ripping off his shirt, and changes into the brilliant silk bowling shirt. Do you think you're going bowling now? Sure. You're not going bowling, she says. So you see this confrontation. She catches hold of his shirt. Why did you do this to her? I done nothing to no one. Let go of my shirt. You've torn it. I want to know. Tell me why, she fires out. So again, confrontational. And towards the end of the play, in scene 11, Stella will ask herself, what have I done? What have I done? In scene 8, why have you done this to her? Tell me why. And again, for Stanley, just a repetition of the things that he said before. When we first met, me and you thought I was common, how right you was. I was common as dirt. You showed me a snapshot of the places with the columns, Belle Reve, and I pulled you down off the columns, and how you loved it, having them coloured lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay till she showed here? So he effectively repeats the sentiments that were expressed between husband and wife out on the porch whilst Blanche was on the phone. The coloured lights are repeated once again, that sexual desire component. And then also in here, this sort of metaphorical idea that he pulled Stella off the white columns of Belle Reve and that she loved that. And I think what he's pointing out here is that in some ways Stanley transformed Stella. He took somebody from her background of this sort of wealthy plantation from the south, and he modernized her. He brought her into the modern world, and the predominant way in which he did that was to show her a more real and rugged and lustful style of life. Stella makes a slight movement. She agrees. Her look goes suddenly inward, as if some interior voice had called her name. She begins a slow shuffling progress from the bedroom to the kitchen, leaning and resting on the back of the chair, and then on the edge of the table. Stanley, finishing with his shirt, is unaware of her reaction. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay till she showed here, hoity-toity, describing me as an ape? Little things as well are clever about William. So, for example, when he says describing me as an ape to Stella, he's revealing to Stella, but Stella, because her water is about to break, I don't think is fully paying attention to what he's saying. He only knows that she's described him as an ape because he's overheard this in scene 4. He suddenly notices a change in Stella. Hey, what is it, Stella? He crosses to her quickly. Stella, take me to the hospital. He is with her now, supporting her with his arm, murmuring indistinguishably as they go outside. So symbolically, in this moment, as Blanche's future being mapped out for her, she's been given the ticket. So the plan is in action at this very moment on her birthday, as her story seems to be coming towards its tragic ending. We have the bell ringing for a symbol of hope, the baby which has fused the Kowalski and Dubois families together.